Hey gang, I hope your semester's off to a great start. The first couple of weeks back can be hectic and exhausting, but I'm sure you're hanging tough. As we discussed last week, David Stevens discusses Gothic literature in terms of the historical and cultural phenomena of the 18th century. But the period that the early Gothic writings takes place in dated all the way back to the medieval period of the Anglo-Saxons and the Normans. Now, while Robert Harris's discussion of the elements of the Gothic in that handout that you downloaded are somewhat more inclusive, he still refers to castles as an essential element. So where does that leave American writing? A nation less than 250 years old doesn't have an ancient past to recall, and we destroyed the land's native culture that could have provided us with one. There are no castles, kings, lords, or knights in our brief history. Is it possible to say that American Gothic even exists? That's what we're going to take a look at in this video. Our sources for this video are these that are listed. Our main source is Alan Lloyd Smith, but I also make reference to the U.S. Supreme Court ruling of Furman versus Georgia and Danse Macabre by Stephen King, as well as a documentary titled Hell, the Devil's Domain. Okay, let's get started. According to literary critic Alan Lloyd Smith, American literature definitely includes Gothic writing. In fact, Lloyd Smith tells us that some literary critics claim that all American writing can be considered Gothic literature. The difference in the American experience led this country's Gothic authors in different directions from those that the British authors followed, Lloyd Smith tells us. Now, they could have simply relied on direct substitutions, like replacing the underground dungeons with basements and subways, and replacing castles with remote houses and things like that. In some cases they did, and still do. But they also worked with America's culture and history to create a unique form of Gothic literature. Now, Lloyd Smith maintains that regardless of the form it takes, Gothic literature is, at its heart, a literature of transgression that pushes past acceptable behavior to realms of the extreme and the excess. By pushing past those borders, Gothic literature calls for a consideration of what the limits are, and after exploring the extremes of cruelty, passion, and fear, it usually reinforces the validity of existing borders, if only by implication. Now, Stephen King points out in his book Danse Macabre that one reason people enjoy horror is because it encodes cultural fears in a way that can be controlled. In most works, the monster is killed or the criminal is caught and chaos is eliminated. According to King, horror literature ultimately soothes us by presenting the possibility that the dangers of our culture can be controlled and all will be well. Now, working within this broader context, Lloyd Smith maintains that certain aspects of the American experience are inherently Gothic, particularly the experiences of religious intensities, alien frontier vistas, isolation, violence, and the darkness cast by slavery and racism. There were also deep anxieties in the early decades of the country about the experimental nature of a new form of government, which, compared to other nations, is really still too young to be termed either successful or unsuccessful. And finally, there were fears of being conquered by European countries, each of which was much more powerful and war-ready than the new nation. The part of the colonies that later became New England was largely founded by groups seeking religious tolerance. However, according to the documentary Hell, the Devil's Domain, many of these groups, particularly the Puritans, were highly intolerant of not only other religions, but also of many standard human instincts, impulses, attitudes, and behaviors. Many Puritan sermons focused not on the joy of Christianity, but on the horror of sin and its resulting punishments. The sermons themselves are so horrifying that some Puritans attended them just for the excitement and titillation of the horror, although, of course, they would seldom admit that, even to themselves. People were known to travel for up to 3 days to hear Jonathan Edwards' sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. And as the title of the sermon suggests, much of that focused on the horrors of the hell that sinners would face, and a fascination with that sense of horror kept Edwards's pews quite full. Lloyd Smith tells us that the Puritans encouraged parishioners to see sin and virtue in terms of black and white with no shades of gray, and the kingdom of light versus the kingdom of darkness. They also attempted to develop a strong sense of guilt and dread in their members. But Puritan theology included an irreconcilable contradiction at its very core. Now, the Puritans insisted on strict observance of rules that demonized any worldly or fleshly pleasures and painted a very dark picture of the future for the souls for those who transgressed. But at the same time, they believed in predestination or predetermination. And here's how the logic of predestination goes. One major premise is that God is omniscient. In other words, he knows every detail of everything, past, present, and future. A second premise is that God is infallible, and that means that God cannot be wrong. Now, let's look at the logic here. If God knows everything that will happen in the future, he knows before people are born whether they will go to heaven or hell. And since he can't be wrong, people can't do anything to affect where they will end up spending eternity. In other words, people don't have free will to determine their behaviors. Now, that concept obviously means that what people do won't have any effect on what happens to them or where they spend eternity. Yet the Puritans had very strict rules for behavior that they tied to religion. Now, because that contradiction doesn't make sense, Puritan theology was ripe for Gothic reflection, Lloyd Smith states. It was filled with the terror of a possible eternity that was horrific beyond description and completely out of a person's control. There was an impending sense of lack of control over the ultimate destination of the soul, and a central, deep, abiding ambiguity of the nature of reality, especially in terms of cosmic reality. Terror, horrific images, loss of control, and ambiguity are all features of Gothic fiction. Now, according to Lloyd Smith, the extremist views of the Puritans and the lingering sense of dooming sin influenced and continue to some degree to influence American thought. Nathaniel Hawthorne, who was a descendant of the Salem witch trials judge John Haythorne, was so ashamed of his ancestors' actions that he changed the spelling and pronunciation of his last name in order to distance himself from the witch trial judge. Hawthorne depicts Puritans themselves and the difference between outward holiness and inward depravity in several of his works, including the short story Young Goodman Brown. Now, Lloyd Smith states that the American frontier also provided a unique experience that was ripe for expression in Gothic literature. Even in the earliest years, before the colonies separated from England, settlers realized that they were living on the edge of a vast land that was completely unknown to European culture, Lloyd Smith tells us. While they were aware of the potential resources, wealth, and benefits that could be gained by expanding westward, they also were aware that a land that is completely unknown could present some very real dangers that they couldn't even imagine. Lloyd Smith maintains that the unexplored expanses of the western frontier, which at that point included everything west of New England and the coastal regions of the southeast, provided a good setting for potential terror in Gothic literature. He states that journeys through unknown lands were easily as twisting and frightening as dungeons, hidden subterranean vaults and passages, and the corridors of gigantic castles, convents, and monasteries. Furthermore, not only did the frontier entail landscapes that were completely foreign to British settlers, such as mountains and deserts, but settlers also knew they might encounter dangerous animals that were completely alien to their experience. Finally, Lloyd Smith tells us that the settlers, especially those who had already been subjected to the defensive attacks of the land's original inhabitants, knew that there was a possibility that the frontier may already be occupied. The settlers knew that some tribes of Native Americans resented having their land overrun by European settlers. Gee, I wonder why, and would violently defend their land through attacks and massacres. The threat of the vast unknown that could be filled with menacing landscapes, animals, and people presented a natural setting for American Gothic fiction. Now, another aspect of the frontier that offered material for Gothic fiction was isolation, according to Lloyd Smith. People who headed west were often separated from other people by miles of wilderness land, some of which created total isolation by surrounding homes with several feet of snow for up to 3 months. That meant that they faced many of the dangers of the frontier completely alone. In addition, they suffered from the psychological effects of long-term isolation, which could lead to anything from severe depression to full-blown breaks with reality. Now, while the frontier eventually became a moot point, the theme of isolation didn't. Modern Gothic and horror works often investigate the psychological isolation that can be created by being an outsider in a small community, or by simply living in a large and caring city. Despite their harsh version of Christianity and demand to strict adherence to biblical law, there were very few Puritan homes that didn't have guns. Of course, guns were a practical necessity in a new land where the absence of grocers required hunting for food. But the violence wasn't contained to hunting. As we've talked about, some early settlers were met with Native American aggressive defense of their property, and they returned violence for violence. In addition, the Salem witch trials demonstrated a willingness to use violence and even cruelty in punishing those who did not adhere to what was largely church-established law. Of course, we know that violence continues to be a prominent feature of the American culture. We're the most violent among any of the industrialized countries. Inner-city gangs kill members of other gangs and even innocent bystanders almost every day. And the violence isn't confined to the inner city. We've seen numerous mass shootings at grade schools, high schools, and colleges in recent years. And those schools have been, some of them anyway, in suburban and fairly rural areas. And we all know that domestic violence continues to plague us, as do rape and pedophilia. Naturally, violence provides a great deal of material for modern Gothic and horror fiction. And many 20th and 21st century books and movies are based on horrors that are pulled straight from the headlines. The very institution of slavery and the idea that one person can purchase another and own him or her, that's a horror in and of itself. But the details of the slavery experience as recorded in slave narratives represent such reprehensible acts that it's difficult to understand how one human being could treat another human being that way. Now, although slavery was abolished in the 19th century, racism lives on and on and on in the United States. And the experiences that people of color face in a country dominated by whites are often unbelievably horrible. The Supreme Court outlawed capital punishment in the 1972 case Furman versus Georgia. While Justices Brennan and Marshall based their argument against the death penalty on the cruel and unusual punishment clause of the Fourth Amendment, other justices opposed the death penalty because it appeared to be imposed arbitrarily and usually indicated a racial bias in the U.S. court system. That decision was reversed, of course, and we had the death penalty again. But there are still always more people of color on death row than whites, even to this very day. And Lloyd Smith notes that the death penalty situation is only one of many that demonstrate that life in America continues to be a different experience for people of color than it is for whites. Stories based on their experiences offer a wealth of material for Gothic and horror fiction, Lloyd Smith says. A final uniquely American experience that Lloyd Smith maintains provides rich material for American Gothic fiction is what was termed the American experiment and fear of falling prey to stronger European nations. As Lloyd Smith explains, the Enlightenment with its new ideas and its new cognitive model that was based on reason and intellect held great hope for a new form of government based on lawmakers that were chosen by the people. The Enlightenment opened the door for the dream of a utopian society, and many Americans in the early years believed that they were creating that utopia. But hope is only one side of the coin. The other side is fear. While optimists in the new country held high hopes, there were also those who saw a much darker possibility. They asked if it was smart to leave policy questions ultimately in the hands of the masses, some of whom might base votes on factors other than reason and the good of the country as a whole, Lloyd Smith says. Could giving the power to the people lead to increased mob action and result in chaos? They wondered. Well, as America's future goes forth, we're still working to find answers to those questions. Lloyd Smith adds that a related fear in early America was based on the knowledge that the small, comparatively impoverished, and militarily unprepared country was open to attacks and invasions from stronger European nations. And such questions obviously provided material for another unique form of Gothic and horror literature for the early nation, Lloyd Smith says. But those questions have far from disappeared. Every election reopens the question of the results of leaving leadership questions to the masses. And with the addition of technology, there are also increased possibilities for tampering with votes, even by people from outside the United States. We always have to ask ourselves, will the election lead to the best possible leadership for the nation as a whole, or will people with personal agendas and attitudes ensure that their needs are met regardless of the overall effect? And of course, each war opens questions regarding America's vulnerability to either political or economic control from outside nations. And the nuclear and biological weapons produced by the United States as well as other countries open an entirely new post-apocalyptic landscape that invites writers to explore the horrors that the future may hold. Now, these are only a few of the factors that open Gothic paths for American writers to follow. As we will discuss, the treatment of women in the field of psychology, beginning with Freud and beyond, are others. Clearly, as Lloyd Smith and others point out, America doesn't need castles, knights, and a medieval past to present Gothic opportunities. We have our own dark spaces and confusing paths filled with potential terrors to explore. I hope this introduction to American Gothic literature was somewhat interesting and helps you to understand where uniquely American horror got its birth. I do recommend that you take notes on some of these characteristics because on future discussion boards you'll have the opportunity to discuss how certain pieces of literature reflect American Gothic elements. So I will talk to you soon. Don't forget that if you have any questions, you can email me from an account other than Canvas, of course, at deborah.oakey@csn.edu. Thanks again for listening to this presentation. I really appreciate it. Have a great day, and we'll talk again soon.